On September 20th, 1973, news broke that singer Gram Parsons had died at the age of just 26. Gram Parsons was one of the great lost talents of 60s and 70s American music. But he broke musical boundaries, and today his work is still hugely influential.
Gram had effortless charm, he had effortless musical skill. Gram was one of the coolest guys in the world.
Handsome and charismatic, he almost single-handedly invented a new musical genre.
He was an innovator, and he didn't even know it.
He wanted to combine country, rock, and blues and create something brand new out of it.
Gram influenced countless musicians, from Keith Richards to R.E.M. to Sheryl Crow. But Gram Parsons was also known for his rock star appetite for drugs and alcohol.
Gram used to drink hard liquor. He did cocaine, and I know he did heroin.
He could have as much as he wanted. That's what was scary about it.
And Gram Parsons died tragically at a California motel only weeks from his 27th birthday.
He had amazing personal style, he was charismatic, he got any girl he ever wanted, and he threw it all away with both hands.
Gram Parsons' death certificate says that he died from drug toxicity. But the amounts of drugs specified in the toxicology report don't appear to be enough to cause the death of a seasoned, heavy drug user. So what happened this time? Was there anything else that compromised his body? I need to investigate all of the evidence to see what brought about his untimely end at just 26 years of age.
World-renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Hunter has conducted thousands of autopsies. He's the chief medical examiner in one of America's biggest cities and investigates suspicious deaths.
When someone has been using a drug for a long period of time, their body develops tolerance to it, meaning they require more and more to get the same high. Gram Parsons was known to be a hardcore user of alcohol and a variety of drugs over a number of years. That's why when I look at the quantities in his body on the night he died, I'm not convinced they would be enough to kill him. So using this detailed autopsy, along with first-hand reports, I'm going to unravel the mystery of what caused his untimely death.
Late summer 1973, Wally Heider's studio, Hollywood, California, 1 month before his death. Gram Parsons is in the studio recording his second solo album, Grievous Angel. Until now, he's had little commercial success. But after his death, this record will become his most acclaimed.
The 73 recording sessions seemed to be a period of great lucidity for Gram and great focus, and he had a sense that finally his ambition was going to bear fruit.
Gram had written a lot of good new songs for the second album. And he did them well. His voice was good, and he had Emmylou.
Gram is collaborating with country singer Emmylou Harris.
They really rehearsed it, and she nailed it. She kind of kept him straight as much as possible. She was the influence on him that he never had.
What I noticed was that they were looking at each other when they were singing. You know, it was really a connection.
I think Gram was so impressed with the amazing talent and the professionalism. There were musicians there that had been with Elvis.
But it's not only Gram's musical focus that's drawing the attention of friends.
At the time of the Grievous Angels recordings, he was overweight, and one friend said he looked like a fat Southern cop.
He was the prettiest boy you ever saw, but he got bloated and kind of chubby and sad looking. He was not the same guy.
Looking at his autopsy, Gram is a young man, just 26. He's 6 foot and weighs 200 pounds. Although this is not excessively large. From accounts, this was heavier than normal for Gram. Serious drug users often appear emaciated as their drug-seeking behavior diminishes food intake. So could this indicate that Gram had recently been cutting back? Or was it simply that he was consuming more alcohol with its high calorie content? I need to investigate this further.
Ingram Cecil Connor III, known as Gram, was born on November 5, 1946, in Winter Haven, Florida, to Ingram Cecil Coondog Connor and his wife Avis. Avis was the daughter of a Florida millionaire, and Gram's father was a World War II flying ace.
Gram Parsons was born into one of the wealthiest families in America. His family was the largest orange grove owners in the country. They had horses, they had boats, they had cars, they had huge houses, they had airplanes. They were the Kennedys of Florida.
Avis encouraged her son's early musical ability, and Gram would sit on the front stoop of the house singing for the village kids. Seeing his idol, Elvis Presley, in 1956, further fueled his passion for music.
It was a lightning bolt. He practiced being Elvis in front of the mirror all the time and knew not only that he would be a singer, he would be a star.
But as he dreamed of stardom, Gram's family life was dealt a shattering blow. His father had never recovered from the trauma he suffered, serving as a flying ace in World War II.
He'd fallen further into depression, turned to alcohol. He drank more and more and more and more. And then Christmas, he shot himself.
12-year-old Gram and his sister, little Avis, were devastated by their father's death. Eventually, Gram's mother went on to marry Robert Parsons, whose surname Gram adopted. Gram escaped his traumatic family life through music. By the time he was 16, he had formed his first professional group, the Shilohs. Through the late 60s, Gram continued to play with acclaimed folk rock groups, including the Byrds, as well as forming his own bands, the most successful being the Flying Burrito Brothers.
The Flying Burrito Brothers were my favorite band of all time. I loved his voice, the songs, everything about them. And he was so charming, as always, real southern, genteel manners. We were just so smitten.
The Flying Burrito Brothers were a very skilled band, and they were playing true country music at a time when no rock and rollers were. There's no doubt that Gram was playing country rock first.
Gram Parsons' death certificate says that he died from drug toxicity. But I'm looking for anything else that could have been a factor. And looking at reports, I can see something significant from a few months before Gram's death.
It was Gram's wife of 2 years, Gretchen Burrell, who noticed a worrying change in his health.
Gretchen said that in 1973, Gram began to suffer brain seizures.
Gram's wife, Gretchen, is the only person to have claimed to have witnessed these seizures. She could have seen him experiencing symptoms such as convulsions, twitching, or even a loss of consciousness. Seizures are triggered by a disturbance in the electrical activity in the brain as a result of multiple causes. But they can also result from serious head trauma. And I can see that Gram was in an accident 3 years before his death.
May 1970, Bel Air, California. Gram was in a creative slump with the panning of the Burrito Brothers' second album, Burrito Deluxe. So he decided to take a trip through California.
In 1970, Gram was hanging out with John Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas. John had a Harley, so Gram had to have a Harley.
Everybody said that he had a motorcycle which he could not handle and didn't understand.
While he was racing up in Bel Air, the front end broke. And it just went into the street and it threw him all over. He was a mess.
We didn't know what actually had happened to the rest of his body, but he had a big purple face. So it really scared us.
Many people think he had head injuries from that and had seizures from it later on.
I can see Gram broke his leg and received a head wound that required stitches. Most people with traumatic brain injury will never experience seizures, and those that do usually occur in the first days or weeks after the incident. But as the accident was 3 years before the seizures supposedly began, and the injury did not appear particularly severe. I'm discounting the motorcycle accident as being linked to his seizures or his death. But seizures can occur when the brain becomes dehydrated or starved of oxygen. This can be triggered by binging, withdrawal, or mixing of drugs and alcohol. And Gram was a prolific user of both.
September 17, 1973, Joshua Tree National Park, California, 2 days before he dies. After the success of the LA recording sessions, Gram decides to celebrate by heading out to the desert.
Joshua Tree National Park was a magical place. There was so much energy there, which is why I think Gram liked it so much.
He just felt peace there.
Gram has recently separated from his wife, Gretchen, so he's rekindled his relationship with an old high school friend, Margaret Fisher.
Graham's marriage was pretty much going in the toilet, so he's hooked up with Margaret, a real pretty girl.
Also along for the ride are Graham's assistant, Michael Martin, and his girlfriend, Dale, and they're all heading out to party.
Now that the album is over, it was time to go out party and have a good time. But little did he know the end was near.
It was at Joshua Tree that Graham's indulgences began to get out of control.
He liked to line up doubles and throw them down.
I think a lot of it was him playing pharmacist. You know, if I take this, I'll have this effect.
I need to investigate Graham's addictions if I'm to fully understand the damage he inflicted on his body and mind. I have here Gram Parsons' autopsy with a full toxicology report. It says that he was drinking heavily on the night that he died. I want to know more about Graham's alcohol consumption and whether it played a crucial role in his death that night.
September 18, 1973, Joshua Tree, California. 1 day before he dies. Graham and his friends are on the hunt for liquor in the small town near Joshua Tree.
Graham says, let's go get a drink. They go to the cocktail lounge. They're sitting drinking tequila. And Graham says to Dale, come on, have a drink. She says, no, I don't want a drink. He says, well, I'm gonna drink for both of us. So he slams 6 double tequilas.
Binge drinking is defined as having 5 or more drinks in a period of about 2 hours. It's particularly dangerous as it has an increased risk of high blood pressure, injuries to the stomach, pancreas, and brain, and heart attack. I can see from reports that Gram would have witnessed this habit from a very early age.
His early life was a Tennessee Williams play.
Everyone drank all the time. Every evening by dinner time, everybody was drunk, and they just got drunker.
Graham's mother, Avis, was an alcoholic, and I think that played a very large part in his life. I don't know that he ever came to terms with it. I think his music was a way to get away from that.
He would have seen Avis drinking every night. He would have seen big parties at his family house with drinking every single night and all day.
Watching the way your parents behave obviously affects what you see as normal, what you see as justifiable behavior. The normalization of drinking was something that he saw at a very early age, and he would have absolutely seen this as par for the course.
Graham's mother Avis's drinking reached a tragic climax when on June 5, 1965, she died from alcohol-related cirrhosis of the liver. At the age of only 18, Graham had now lost his father to suicide and his mother to alcoholism.
The subject was never brought up and how it had affected him. I mean, he wasn't forthcoming with, psychological evaluation of himself.
But his mother's death from alcoholism failed to be the wake-up call for his own drinking.
Alcohol definitely was in control, but he would never acknowledge it.
And in June 1970, Gram's years of heavy drinking took their toll on the one thing he loved, when his band, the Flying Burrito Brothers, dropped him.
Why did Parsons leave the group?
He went his way and we went ours.
Was it musically speaking, or just you broke up, there was some anger in the group? Or?
Sometimes people have trouble getting together. Yeah, that's what happened.
I don't think they wanted to carry his weight as far as the alcohol is concerned.
He was drinking so much that he wouldn't rehearse, he missed gigs, he performed terribly, he became a terrible prima donna, and the band suffered as a result.
And Gram could afford as much drugs and alcohol as he wanted because of his family background.
Gram's trust supplied him with $100,000 a year in the late 1960s and early 1970s. That is a lot of money.
He was spending that money however he wanted to. And a lot of it was on drugs, yeah. And becoming an alcoholic.
It's clear that Gram drank heavily for much of his life, and his autopsy describes a liver with fatty degeneration. This can be a symptom of excessive alcohol consumption over many years. And I can also see from the coroner's report that this was no different on the night he died. It states that Gram had a 0.21 blood alcohol concentration in his system. At Gram's weight, this is the equivalent of around 10 standard drinks, enough for most people to be severely intoxicated, but in general, not enough to kill you. Someone of Gram's size would need a blood alcohol concentration of around 0.40 in order to endanger their lives. So, I don't think alcohol alone was responsible for his death.
September 18th, 1973, Joshua Tree Inn, California, 15 hours before he dies. Back at the hotel, Gram and his friends have been drinking and smoking weed.
Gram brought, as usual, the strongest pot in the history of the world. Unbelievable. You know, I used to get lids of pot, but it was nothing like what he got.
By Tuesday, they're on to their last joint. So Michael, Gram's assistant, is sent back to LA to get more marijuana.
The coroner's report listed no marijuana in Gram's body, but this was under the more basic testing of 1973, where it's possible it would not have shown up. If he was smoking marijuana and he was mixing it with alcohol, the effects can be highly unpredictable. Marijuana affects the way your brain processes information. It contains at least 60 types of cannabinoids, chemical compounds that react with receptors in the brain. The result can be either positive, magnifying mood, or negative, leading to paranoia and anxiety. And in combination with alcohol, it can cause dizziness, nausea, and vomiting. However, looking at reports from the time, I can see that Gram was also using far more powerful substances, prescription drugs.
September 18th, 1973, Joshua Tree, California, 6.5 hours before his death. Gram and Margaret returned to the bars in town.
He loved to hang out in these horrible, seedy bars in Joshua Tree and Yucca Valley. He would go out there, he would play music, he would do drugs.
Gram did always kind of mix his drugs.
Gram took any kind of an upper, Dexedrine, Dexamyl. He not only got, well, he got grumpy, he got to be a real asshole, genuine, certified asshole. But he did it anyhow.
Dexamyl contains both barbiturate and amphetamine. The amphetamine elevates mood, while the barbiturate or downer counters the agitating side effect of the amphetamine. It can also be highly addictive. But these were not the only prescribed drugs that Gram was taking.
He took Placidils, he took Reds and the Tuanols, and so did I.
You'd have to take an Ambien to sleep, and it's a druggy excuse. I've got to take the Ambien because I'm wired.
Placidil, Tuanol, and Ambien are all used for anxiety or insomnia and can also be addictive. I can see that Gram would have witnessed the effect of prescription drug abuse from a very early age.
In the mid-1950s, Gram's family were living in Waycross, Georgia. But his mother, Avis, was becoming increasingly depressed. And along with her drinking, she was taking prescribed drugs.
Avis's preference for barbiturates all stems from the heartbreak and depression and trauma of coon dog suicide.
I think the whole point of taking drugs for a lot of people is escape. Escape from pain, escape from difficult thoughts, escape from life. And barbiturates, because they mask anxiety. Mom was doing something that was good for her, was, mother's little helper, right?
Gram not only saw Avis take her Secanols, but he raided her medicine cabinet routinely to see what she had in it and what he could take.
The person who you ultimately feel arguably safest with, the person who kind of guides you through life to, teaches you how to cope, is someone that regularly took anti-anxiety medications. And as a consequence, it was seen probably by Gram as something positive.
I think the drugs and alcohol masked his ability to come to terms with his childhood.
He did keep a lot of his emotions inside, like Southern boys do, especially men from that era, especially Southern men from that era.
I can see from an interview with Gram's doctor that he'd been prescribed the anti-anxiety medications Valium and Placidil on several occasions. But looking at the toxicology report, I see no trace of these drugs in his blood, which could indicate he wasn't using these when he died. However, there is a trace of amphetamines in his urine, which confirms he'd been using this in the run-up to his death. Combining this drug with alcohol can be lethal, as the stimulant properties of amphetamines can mask the intoxication from alcohol. Conversely, alcohol can blunt the effects of amphetamine, leading the user to consume dangerous levels of both. However, I'm pretty sure Gram had taken this combination on many occasions, so I don't believe this alone would be enough to kill him. But it seems his need and desire for a cocktail of drugs was limitless.
February 1969. Gram and his band, the Flying Burrito Brothers, are about to release their first and most acclaimed album, The Gilded Palace of Sin. At the same time, the band decided to tour.
Gram liked trains, so he talked A&M Records into a train tour.
Touring by train was an exciting concept to them. It was old-fashioned, it was country, it was, it was just some thrilling idea.
Now, it was the same time as Woodstock, and we turned down Woodstock to take a train to Detroit. Talk about a bad career move.
The band's train tour went to Chicago, Detroit, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. It also coincided with the climax of Gram's cocaine habit.
Gram did cocaine all the time, and I would venture to say every single day.
We were there when the train pulled out of the station, and it was scary. I knew it was going to be a wild ride.
During the train trip, it was drugs on us, the cocaine. It was the drugs du jour.
I heard later that he had to have surgery on his nose and everything. He did so much coke.
I'm not St. Philip. I was partaking, but there's a little mechanism in my head that says, time's up. Go home, go to bed, stop doing what you're doing. He didn't have that.
Cocaine has a very specific effect. It blocks the removal of dopamine from the brain, the chemical that regulates mood. Dopamine then accumulates in the synapses, causing the euphoria associated with taking the drug. The toxicology report states that Gram had traces of cocaine in his urine. Cocaine mixed with alcohol is particularly dangerous. The two drugs interact to increase the depressive effects of alcohol and make the person's reaction to cocaine stronger, dangerously raising the risk of heart attack and even sudden death. Gram had been mixing alcohol and drugs throughout his adult life. But this report also states he was using one of the most potent drugs of all, heroin.
Nobody talks about a moment when suddenly Gram was shooting up. It's just he fell into the heroin lifestyle, fell into that world.
By July 1971, Gram had been out of the Flying Burrito Brothers for a year. With little creative direction and no record deal, he and then girlfriend Gretchen were invited by Keith Richards to join him and the other Rolling Stones at Chateau Nelcot in the south of France.
He was actually a groupie for Keith Richards.
First of all, they're very creative. And I think they had a love of doing drugs. And I think that love of doing drugs and that creativity that they shared gave them a bond.
The Stones were at Chateau Nelcot to make Exile on Main Street, and the recording sessions for the album were famed as much for the drug taking as they were for the music.
The drug life at Nelcot was just insane. Keith bought some very high-end heroin off some Corsican mobsters. The story goes that Keith took a big hit and passed out on the floor, and when he woke up, his first words were, "I'll take the whole lot."
His adoration of the Stones, I think, made him want to follow in, Keith's footsteps in that way. And then, of course, obviously, you're either an addict or you're not, and he was an addict.
When heroin is injected, it activates opioid receptors deep within the brain, releasing the neurotransmitter dopamine. The level of dopamine in the brain controls the experience of pleasure and pain in the body. But repeated use of heroin reduces the nerve cell receptors that dopamine acts upon. So Gram would have sought larger and larger amounts to get an ever-diminishing high.
Gram was deep in the grip of heroin. Like Keith, he really liked it, and he could afford it, and he could afford the best, and his body could take it.
After the other members of the Stones became increasingly frustrated with his drug taking, Gram was asked to leave Nelcot.
It's important to remember that Keith thought Gram was doing too much heroin. And if Keith Richards is running your intervention, you're in trouble.
So was it Gram's relentless consumption of large quantities of heroin that finally killed him?
September 18th, 1973, roommate Joshua Tree Inn, California, 7 p.m., 5.5 hours before he dies. After a day of drinking in the local bars, Gram and Margaret return to their room. On the hunt for drugs, they arrange to meet a dealer at another room in the hotel. The dealer arrives at room 1 with several vials of morphine.
Only Margaret knows anything about the dealer that brought the liquid morphine to the hotel. She describes her as a young blonde woman. She showed up, she brought stuff, she vanished. She really is a mystery woman.
The dealer is said to have injected Gram with liquid morphine sulfate. Morphine is a legal pain reliever, and heroin is the drug's illegal derivative, made by combining the drug with the chemical agent acetic anhydride. But both are highly addictive, and if too much is taken, overdose and death can occur. And I can see from reports that he immediately asked for another dose.
He shot up some more, and that's when he passed out.
Margaret knew Gram was in trouble as soon as he finished injecting that dose. His head rolled back, his breathing got labored. She knew things were difficult.
Slowed breathing and extreme lethargy are classic signs of overdose. Despite taking a weaker form of opiate, Gram's condition has become critical.
7:30 p.m., Joshua Tree Inn, room 1. 5 hours before he dies, Margaret calls Dale for help.
Dale, I'm in room 1, it's Gram, you gotta come.
The two women try and lift Gram up to carry him back to his room.
Gram was a big guy. She couldn't budge him on the bed. She couldn't physically stir him. She had to get Dale to help.
It was getting pretty scary. He'd had to be walked around and woken up.
7:45 p.m., less than 5 hours before he dies, Margaret and Dale arrive back at room 8.
What do we do?
They put Gram in the shower and got water, cold water on him. And Margaret said, go get some ice and push ice up his ass, which is an old trick that druggies have used for 100 years.
The morphine makes you lethargic, so the ice in the anal layer gives you a shock. And it seemed to work. They brought him back to life.
Needless to say, inserting ice cubes into the rectum is not an advisable medical procedure and can cause serious harm known as vasovagal reaction. This is where the major nerve that slows the heart, the vagus nerve, is tricked into firing off. The shock to Gram's system seemed to momentarily revive him.
8 p.m., 4.5 hours before he dies. With Gram now in a stable condition, Margaret leaves Dale and Gram in the hotel room as she heads off to buy coffee and food. But Dale is unaware that she should keep Gram moving.
He probably seemed to be doing okay, and that's why Margaret went to go get coffee.
Once Margaret has left, Gram falls asleep again while Dale watches him. But his breathing returns to its labored state. Dale thinks that Gram's breathing has become dangerously shallow.
He goes into shock again. And Dale is giving him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation.
His heartbeat was getting fainter, his breath was faltering, and she got worried that he was dying.
11:45 p.m., less than an hour before he dies.
Margaret came back and they couldn't revive him this time.
He wasn't breathing, they couldn't find a pulse. That's when Margaret learned how serious it was.
The coroner's investigation tells me that on finding Gram unresponsive, Margaret Fisher phoned the hotel manager and an ambulance was called. But after the women's failed attempts at CPR, the signs are not good.
Midnight, the ambulance arrives. Gram still has a pulse but is unconscious. He's rushed to the local hospital.
When the ambulance took him away, I think the two girls went to the hospital, but nobody saw him when he died.
That's when Philip and I got the phone call from Dale, and I answered the phone, and she said, I need to speak to Philip. And I could tell by the sound of her voice that something was drastically wrong.
12:15 a.m. Gram is brought to High Desert Memorial Hospital, Yucca Valley, California.
This report states that the paramedics tried to revive him with an injection of adrenaline into his heart, and twice by defibrillation. But he was cold and cyanotic when he arrived at the hospital. In Gram's case, this means that his lips had turned blue because of the lack of oxygen in the blood, and it's a classic sign of drug overdose.
Gram Parsons was officially pronounced dead at 12:30 a.m. on Wednesday, September 19th. He was just 26 years old.
You know, it's one of those moments you never ever forget. It's always so devastating, you can't put it into words, but it was also for me his loss, that he was losing out on completing what he had come here to do.
I felt betrayed. I felt angry. I felt resentful. I wanted to slap the crap out of him. And I would have, but he was dead.
Immediately after Gram died, there was a bizarre twist in the tale. 2 months before his death, Gram had made a pact with 5 of his friends.
Whoever died first, the remainder of us would be responsible for having the body cremated and the ashes scattered at Joshua Tree.
The day after his death, Philip Kaufman and Michael Martin stole Gram's coffin from LAX airport prior to its return to his family in New Orleans.
It just so happens Dale owned a hearse. And we went out into the desert, into the still of night, about 3 o'clock in the morning. We took the coffin out, slid it off, and it hit the ground. And there he was. So I poured the gas on him, lit a match, and threw it in. Woof! big flame went up and his ashes were going straight up into the desert. It was very eerie. Several days later, we're taken to court. We were charged with stealing a coffin. The body had no intrinsic value. And that was the end of Gram, and that was the end of the story.
The coroner's report was compiled before the bizarre burning of Gram's body, so fortunately we have retained all of the information from the autopsy. Since his death, much rumor and speculation has circulated around what caused it. One such rumor was that Gram took the second dose of morphine not to get high, but to end his own life.
Gram had always told me and anybody else that he felt he was going to die early.
Gram was a classic depressive. They looked at Gram and saw, he's already gone. He's next.
Gram Parsons had spent 2 days at Joshua Tree drinking and taking an array of drugs. Back at his hotel, he then insisted on injecting not 1, but 2 doses of morphine. Was the second dose a desire to get high as possible, or was it an indication of a more desperate state of mind?
Gram had always told me and anybody else that he felt he was going to die early, and that would be his legacy to the music business.
Gram was a classic depressive. I mean, if you look at what happens to children of suicides, depression is always there.
The last time I saw him, he seemed depressed. I think he was probably disappointed in himself for becoming addicted to various substances that drew him away from his music and his joy.
Somebody who's an addict is certainly in a much more precarious position than someone who isn't. The question therefore becomes, does he care that this is that bad for him? And if the answer is no, he doesn't care. Maybe he's on a path to self-destruct because ultimately that's what he's seen around him growing up.
Despite the emotional turbulence of his childhood and his ongoing addictions, I do not believe that the second dose of morphine was the culmination of a death wish. Gram appeared excited about his new album, and the statement in the coroner's report says he was a little depressed, but not so much as to take his own life.
When you talk about Gram and whether he felt fated to live a long life or not, it's important to remember that he was just careless. He was incredibly careless about his own existence.
When I look at the amount of morphine in the toxicology report, it states that there were 228 milligrams per kilogram of morphine found in Gram's liver and bile. This is a large amount, but again, I doubt any higher than what Gram was used to. So what happened on that night? Looking deep within the coroner's report, I believe I found the answer. It states by the time of his last recording, he was making an effort to kick drugs.
Gram had gotten a lot better off. He wasn't cured, he wasn't clean, but he wasn't as dirty.
Emmylou Harris got Gram to clean up for those sessions, to drink less, to do fewer drugs. She was the iron fist in the velvet glove.
Gram cut down on his heroin intake on Grievous Angel. I don't believe he did it while he was recording.
I mean, you never know, but he functioned much more highly, so the assumption is he was doing a good deal less, had better concentration. Certainly he never sang so well.
When heroin users abstain from the drug or cut down even only for a matter of days, their body's tolerance nosedives. But when addicts start taking the drug again, a common fatal mistake is that they use a similar dose to when they were regularly using.
Dr. Hunter can now reveal what was happening in Gram Parsons' body the night he died.
Gram had taken cocaine and amphetamines that could have masked the downer effects of morphine, making it more likely he would want to inject a larger dose. Gram had also drunk a large quantity of alcohol. In combination with morphine, this would have multiplied the toxic effects on his body, dangerously lowering his heart rate and respirations. With his lowered heart rate and breathing, it's likely he slipped into a coma. During this time, the flow of oxygen to his brain would have drastically reduced as a result of respiratory depression. The years of alcohol and drug abuse would have undoubtedly weakened Gram's body, from high blood pressure and stiffened arteries to damage to the liver and heart. I have no doubt that if Gram had lived and had continued to take drugs in this way for much longer, he would have been a ticking time bomb. But ironically, it seems what ultimately killed Gram that night wasn't the second shot of morphine. What killed Gram was that he shot up at his old dose, and his body could not take it. Gram Parsons was a gifted country rock star who spent his life masking a tragic childhood with drugs and alcohol. Gram's tragedy was that as he made a serious attempt to straighten out his life, his body could simply not take one more night of excess, just as he was reaching his creative peak.
He was able to combine country and rock and roll and have it mesh together. And it was basically his own sound.
I hope Gram will be remembered as one of the truly great American singer-songwriters, and that his songwriting will be remembered for the exquisite, sensitive, difficult, profound, and insightful music it is. That's my hope.
He just wanted to create something brand new, which he called cosmic American music, and that is his legacy, and that is what his reason for being on Earth was. There was no one like him.